Good afternoon. Welcome to our session entitled, if you don't mind the exact title for everyone, it will be a few seconds to show our slideshow. So this session is entitled PM Square and Open Source, and Power to the Community as a subtitle, which inspires hopefully today a different approach to PM Square, a more open-minded and more aggressive perhaps approach to PM Square adoption. So thank you for joining us. It is, I would say, a very special panel because we have very diverse viewpoints today represented. We have first Despina Mitropoulou, director of the GFOS, government initiative, I think, for open source. Isn't it, Despina?
Yes, it's
Wonderful.
a non-profit organization that represents open source in Greece.
Excellent. And of course, being very active with government, you know the ins and outs of their viewpoints. It's good that you don't represent them. It's good that you represent a third party, but you have opinions about public sector. And
Yes.
we have Ionut, who's also active in the public sector, but today represents the PM Square Alliance as the regional representative or coordinator for Romania.
Hi, nice to meet you all. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Ionut. And we both have, I would say, perspectives that are, I would say, contrasted, the three of us. I'm from academia, Stephane Gagnon, based in Canada, active also in the open source a little bit community, but primarily as a teacher in IT and PM. So therefore, the three viewpoints will hopefully today bring, I would say, value to the whole agenda. I will invite, of course, our participants to actively post questions and answers onto our chat as well as the question area. We currently have the Whova app ready to watch your questions and bring them into the discussion today. So I will start, if you don't mind, right away. Of course, having had here a brief overview of the panel. The panel, of course, is focused on the issue that PM Square being open source, it represents a set of opportunities, but in the same time, a set of challenges for the community overall, as well as for each adopters in some ways. And the discussion today is focused on the fact that there are major efforts, major works to be engaged by the PM Square Alliance itself, by the community themselves, to make sure that the open source nature of the asset of PM Square remains valuable and remains current. So there are challenges of operational challenges. And then overall, we're trying today to discuss the relative distinctiveness of PM Square. To what extent is open source such a major advantage? That will be a topic to address today. So we described obviously our presenters, and we also have two facets. The first facet in a few minutes will be the general advantage of PM Square, and the second set of questions will be more detailed, specific to open source. We just would like to thank very much Nikos and Elias for sending us questions that were, as organizers, very sharp and forced us a lot to have a lot of interactions before. So, but the debates will remain today. So therefore, there's no perfect convergence. So first set of questions. What is, in your opinion, the PM Square advantage? Which I'm sure everybody has been asked during the conference in the past couple of days. And what are the advantages of project management methodologies such as PM Square being open source? But just as a brief point. And I generally in classroom would ask who wants to answer first. But since Despina, your microphone is on, I would invite you first, please.
Okay, thank you, Stephane. Thanks for having us in this panel and for the introductions. And as you said, I would also like to thank, apart from you and Ionut, that you're here in this panel, Nikos and Elias, for all their contribution to the questions that we have so far. So obviously, I know that both you and Ionut will describe that later on, but from our perspective, and the clear advantage that we have in PM Square is obviously that it is flexible, it is simple, it is cross-sector, and it is modular. So, having said that, although it is simple, we can see that it can be adjusted in many cases and in many sectors. But I will leave that to Ionut to say more, because he represents the PM Square Alliance. I will go from my side, as I mostly represent the open source communities, that for us the most important feature is that it is open and free. So it does not only allows the creation of derivatives that can be shared freely with other partners in the community, but it allows the community to actually contribute and improve the methodology. This always is always an important factor for open source communities, because the involvement of the community always gives a feeling of ownership, and it makes communities more engaged.
Thank you very much. It's actually very to the point, in fact. And for units, what would be the, I would say, a different answer, or most likely perhaps a radically different answer? We don't know.
No, I think Despina mentioned quite a few valuable points for PM Square. Obviously, PM Square has several advantages over the other methodologies out there, and we can name just a few that immediately become visible when you get in touch with the methodology. The first one that you get is its size. So if you take PMBOK, for example, or the PM Square guide, and you put them together, you can immediately see a difference in size. And I would like to point out that this is actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, because the learning curve is different. So obviously, getting to understand and know a methodology that's more nimble and agile and you can use right away is much more approachable than something that's a big book that you would need at least a month to have a first read. So obviously, this is a clear advantage. Another advantage, as I see you put it there on screen, is the fact that as it started within the European institutions, it has already at least two usages out of the box. So, for example, one of them is the use in the administration. So going back to its origins, obviously, it was built with this idea in mind that it will serve the administration. And now that it is open, it can be used across other organizations in public administration, but due to the way it is built, it is also very easy to adopt in the private sector as well. So I think these two directions already give it a very strong advantage right from the start. The other advantage that I could mention is also regarding the fact that it has been adopted since it became an open methodology. It has been adopted in different sectors. So that means that we have customized versions for different areas. And we even have in the conference these days, we have several other presentations that discuss exactly that, how you can use it in the infrastructure sector or for other types of projects. So I invite you to have a look at those, because obviously these help much more if they are tailored to the specific domain rather than having something generic. So these are clearly elements that support the methodology. And I already mentioned it a bit, but it is a very important aspect, is the fact that it is open and it is free. And I think this is a very important milestone going forward, because having a methodology that's open encourages the community to contribute. And we have another session that I presented with one of my colleagues, Evangelos, about our GitHub project, in which we actually invite the community to contribute towards the improvement and the evolution of the methodology. So I think just from the start, these are very useful points that would help people decide to adopt PM Square.
Thank you very much. I would add from an external viewpoint, since I'm based in Canada, that it's been about 2.5 years that I'm working with the methodology, especially we're using it in a project that I have a session on, business technology management. And I would like to add the fact that I've always seen since day one, actually, that it's truly very generic and very global in aim. Yet it was not aimed as such, but it became as such, I think, because of its nature, I guess. These are advantages indeed that's not easily found in others, indeed. We would move on, if you don't mind, to the next set of questions that are very focused on the open source issue. And these questions were sent by Nikos a few days ago, actually. So we had very little time to actually debate yet. Today is a good chance. So there are 7, and therefore, if you don't mind for the audience, please, we will go through each one at a time. They are very diverse. They start from more general strategic issues to more operational, even technical issues, the forking dimension. So question 1. And that is a very big one. And some people on our question at Q&A might have very clear answers on that. Please feel free. It's a free forum. What's wrong with non-open source methodologies? And are there any disadvantages that are so dramatic that we need an open source one? It seems that we've managed fine for decades without any. Ionut?
Well, have we? I think that's
It's
the
an open question.
there. Have we managed just fine? Because personally, looking around, I think there is a lot of room for improvement. And an open methodology as compared to a closed methodology enables faster adoption, enables the community to share and reuse this methodology, and also to actually challenge it every time. Because if it's a closed copyrighted methodology, then it's much more difficult to change the direction in which the organization that owns it decided to go. So obviously, having it open gives you a much broader area of movement. So that's just one thing. So having it open also is very good for, let's say, organizations that cannot invest upfront so much. And when I'm saying investment, I'm not talking just about money. I'm talking about time, because this is something that needs to happen to ensure that you have the right people with the right skills to establish the appropriate structures in place as other methodologies state. So all of these elements might be forbidding for some organizations. So obviously having an easier alternative is always a good option.
Excellent. And for Despina, please.
Yes, if I can just build on what Ionut and you just said, I think that today we are in a stage that we have to change the way we are thinking, and the change of culture. And I strongly disagree with we've managed fine so far. As you can see, what's happening in the world. Obviously, we're not managing fine in certain levels, but anyway, I won't go starting debating why we need more open source in our lives, because I won't stop talking. But as we can see that it's even with the recent announcement of the open source strategy that the Commission did a few weeks ago, it seems that there is a growing need for more open source projects, and there is a direct push to go to this way. And there's an increase to outreach to the open source communities and to integrate more open source as a default principle. So I think from my point of view, it was about time to have that kind of methodologies. And since, as you said, you are already using it for 2.5 years, and this, although it seems that it just came out, it's a mature project because it has been used internally with the Commission for so long. And since, we're talking about a bureaucratic organization, if I can say, and, they have heavy procedures, and, if they were looking for something more efficient, and this is the way that, and the tool that they used, obviously, it's something that other organizations will benefit from. So I think right now we are studying in a period where there is an effort to change the culture and to think more open. So I think the open PM Square methodology is just on time for that.
Thank you. Indeed, also again, from a viewpoint from outside, the first look we take at PM Square is, of course, a methodology ready to implement. And in that sense, when we go and browse the top ones, we could mention them if you wish, but Prince2, PM Bach, and others, we immediately see that they are frameworks that need to be honed and that need to be learned and appropriated first before even conceiving a methodology, a process. And even in addition to that, selecting the proper rules that will be implemented from those. So therefore, yes, indeed, I think an open methodology versus a closed framework was definitely necessary for, again, as Ionut said, smaller entities or entities that are not mature enough in PM. I think this is indeed the most important facet. Another disadvantage has been the issue of the vetting process. How are standards vetted by their respective organizations? I have been very much in debates over the past 2 years with lots of organizations, including PMI and others, and literally about 20 actually that I have contacted and requested, would you consider having an open source asset? Would you consider joining an open source project, whereas it would benefit your project by importing certain parts of our open assets? And those organizations have clearly stated repetitively, it is not in our plans. It will never be. That is actually quite strange, by the way, for you to hear. And said thirdly, very clearly, the integration, or I would call again the word arrimage in French, the proper connecting of certain assets to other competing assets is literally a complete strategic blockage. So therefore, it seems to me that it was indeed necessary that a group decides to make such an asset, such as PM Square. Number two, that a group will have the patience to go through the long startup curve, which the Alliance has barely started a year ago, if I recall now. Ionut, you may confirm when it happened. So therefore, it seems to me clearly that the answer to this, as painful as it is, and as perhaps unfair as it is as a question, is unfortunately yes. It's also a part also of the issue of what has been happening is lack of innovation, and that is what needs to change. The next question will be hopefully a bit easier. Demand. Who was asking for such a methodology? Why did we actually? Oh, we need one. Fair. Who's going to use it? Who wish to perhaps attack, please?
Shall I? Oh, go on, Ionut.
No, please. If you have an answer, please.
I have an answer, yes, but I am fully sure that you will compliment my answer. So as I said again, from our perspective, in the open source community and in all open source projects, we now have an open source methodology. So we have a methodology that actually fits our philosophy. So from the open source community perspective, there was a need for an open source methodology, and there was a demand. But there are also many open source management platforms and tools that, like Redmine, Open Project, and others as well. And an open source methodology can work complementary to these tools. And today we have, although Stephane said, the answer a couple of years ago was we have no plans into integrating any open source component in our assets or in our projects. Today we have more and more public organizations as well as the private sector that, not only do they integrate the open source projects in their projects or components, but they also have a need to be more agile, and they have to be more efficient. So there's definitely a need for a methodology that can be adapted to the user needs. And I think, as we've already said from the beginning, PM Square methodology does exactly that. So I'll hand it to you now, Ionut.
Yes, thank you. So my answer here would be more linked to was there a demand? And the answer is yes, there was a demand. And by just looking around, we can figure out that when we're talking about things that are open and accessible to all, what happens actually, there are two things. The first one is they become a de facto standard. If you want a common language, because it's much easier to speak the same language like we do now with English. We chose a common language and we understand each other. And it's the same thing with project management. If we speak the same language, if we say that we need to do the same things in a project and we are all in agreement, then the project success factor increases by an order of magnitude. So that's just the first thing. The second thing is that when we're looking at the market, and not just this industry, in all industries, whenever you have something that's proprietary, it has to have a lot of investment in keeping it alive. I mean, I don't know if anybody remembers, for the IT world, we had this programming language called COBOL, and we had mainframes that ran on it. And it's 20, 30 years ago, not so long ago. And try to search for an expert there now. And from an organization perspective, especially if you have organizations that span across several generations, this becomes a great risk factor. And obviously choosing something that's more standardized and on which people can have access to easily, and that can be understood and learned easily, it's a very important thing, because this creates competition in the market. And competition is always beneficial to the end client. So this is why an open methodology is always good, because it actually forces the market to improve and increase its own value in order to offer the best they can to the customers.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you to both of you. I would like to add one item, if you don't mind, at the bottom of the screen, that Nikos was asking us any other such success cases, and we all know Scrum, of course. The co-authors of Scrum, the initial manifesto and all the other assets, developed Scrum guides, which are licensed, as you see, exactly the same license as EUPL, which is compatible to CC by SA. And the more important factor is that, of course, Scrum came at a time when there was kind of a vacuum of clear agile methods, as you recall. At that time, agile methods were competing. Many were, I would say, again, a bit esoteric. Extreme programming was difficult for non-programmers to gather, and all the other team members of generic projects had difficulty adopting it. Meanwhile, Scrum came in to clarify things. And I think that is an interesting factor here. The demand is for what? Is the demand for a methodology? Is the demand for freedom? Or isn't the demand for clarity? That is the question mark I think we still need to investigate. Because the feelings of the professionals, is not the same at all the stages and all the, of course, level of maturity. Again, here, one point, the generic, I would say, guess or guesstimate would be 50% of very mature professionals are sick and tired of seeing the same thing all the time. They wish to innovate. And that is where the demand might be very strong. Another packet of demand, as you've described, are those organizations that have no choice to innovate, and they will do. And third, of course, the smaller ones. So the demand potential at all sides of the market are all very good. And they're all quite clearly going to tilt toward those things that they want. Because strangely enough, PM Square in the state it is today already offers those. So the demand, I believe, will not flatten. It will continue. Yeah.
If I may just add one thing
to
what you just mentioned. There is a quote from the founder of the Ford car manufacturer that he stated that if you would ask before the cars what would the people want, they would have said that they would want a faster horse. So sometimes the solution is not necessarily understood right away by everybody.
Yes.
So this is why our mission is also to make people understand that the added value that is being offered might not be what they're looking for, but it is definitely something that they need. So this is what also is very important going forward.
Yes, exactly. And sorry if I also can intervene in that. I think that, you can see that the demand was there by watching how quickly there is an adaptation now and how many people are organizations are using PM Square and why we are having this talk today either. So obviously we can say from the results that there was a demand and there was a place in the market for PM Square.
And it's also not drying out, which is a good thing. Nowadays, with markets literally in shamble, I would say, the PM Square market will not be. That's the obvious fact. It's a good thing. The next question, and by the way, I mentioned that we are close to the middle of our session, so question 3 already, which means we have 4 questions left, and that leaves a lot of room for discussion with the attendees. We have 3 questions online so far. So question 3. What can we do as practitioners with an open source methodology that I couldn't do before with, of course, a closed source mostly? And how does it change my life for the better in general?
I would say the same way that all open resources do, that, you can now exchange knowledge, where you can share best practices, you can share materials. That's, things that you can do when you were working with closed or proprietary methodologies before. Now that you have access to more resources, so whenever you have more knowledge, that can only be for a good cause. So this can only change, I think, life for the better. So, and if we're being practical, it's always good to, have more resources available. So again, I'm talking from the open source point of view, but for us, this is, again, the most important feature.
Excellent. Ionut?
Yes, so I think the question is a bit tricky because it depends on from what perspective you're looking. I mean, if you have an organization that has an established methodology, you're not changing, everything is the same way and it's going to be the same way for the next 50, 40, 60, 100 years from now, then probably you don't need to change. But then the question is, will your organization remain the same for the next 50 years? Because as I mentioned a bit earlier, when we're talking about standards, having yourself closed into a box will limit you in the amount of activities that you can do. And as time goes by, If that methodology is not shared by a larger community, like Despina said, then your costs will go up. And I don't know who wants that, because it's not about the means to an end, because the methodology is a means to an end. It's about how much time and money you're willing to spend into getting where you want to get. Because in the end, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at being faster, being more efficient, and being more connected with the outside world. And an open methodology provides exactly that. As Despina said, a greater community, a source of answers that's larger than the one that you could get from a closed community, and the ability to reach out more easily and to get professionals from the market much more easily than compared to a closed source method.
Excellent. And so thank you very much indeed. The question is from the viewpoint of the practitioner who has 3, 4 methodologies available, and a PMO also. The reason I mentioned the PMO is because they kind of call the shots, as we say. They tell us as practitioners what we must abide for. And I would say it creates opportunity for dissent. Isn't that possible in PM? As you saw in many studies of PM, dissent by the PM leader is a factor of success by not following the rules entirely, as we know. The question of changing the methodology for one's project as opposed to not having that right, of course, that's one major difference. The question also of executives, as you mentioned, Ionut, about the issue of openness outside organizations. Very often, executives say specific guidelines that professionals have no choice. I mean, communications outside is limited. Security factors make it difficult to even share any practices. In many ways, having the practice already out there makes those guidelines trivial, literally. And therefore, executives have no choice but to leave people free. So there are facets that change, of course, many aspects, both for the practitioner and the executives. And the PMO, I believe, is probably going to be the place where PM Square is going to have the most impact. Perhaps one day we won't need a PMO anymore. Isn't that a question mark that anyone has had? I wish to ask myself. There is a strand of literature, by the way, in academic journals about the critical theory or critical perspective criticizing the oppressive factors at play against people in PM. And that has been a relatively interesting set of literature because it says that PMOs effectively are more cumbersome than anything else in many ways. And is the openness of that methodology, PM Square, going to change that factor? Is it going to rebalance the power, again, the power balance? Those are open questions. And academics, of course, will spend decades studying PM Square on that. Of course, I'm may not be just more than 2 years, but at least it's going to be an interesting problem to study. So I will go on with the fourth question of 7. Who will support the asset? And I'm assuming both of you exactly have very interesting answers on this. Despina, if you wish, please.
Yes, I know we have already put as an answer here, and people can see that we are saying that, we have already people from public sector and academic members that work on creative derivatives, but and there are innovators, of course, that are eager to work. I'm going to say I think this is not enough per se, because as you said that, and as Ionut said before, that we know for all projects to be viable, even for open source projects, I'm going to say, there is obviously a need for professional support at some points, and that will provide consultation to users, especially when we're talking, as you said before, maybe I don't represent the public administration, but we are working closely with them with certain times. So we do know that, they will require professional support, and not only the public administration, but also the private sector. So whoever is, supporting professionally They just need to make sure that, the maintainers of the methodology, that there should be a provision for community building. And, and not only building a community, but also maintaining and nurturing this community. As I said, we have seen in all successful open source projects, and this is not uncommon, that usually there is a big organization or a foundation, even a company at some points, behind the project that supports and helps the community with funding and resources. So this is why, as I said before, it is important to have maybe a reference specification guide of PM Square adaptation in different open source management platforms that already exist. And I know, and with this, I'm going to hand it to Ionut, that, one of the missions of PM Square Alliance, and this is why, partially they were created, is to facilitate the creation of this ecosystem, the business ecosystem that will support the users and the business in adapting and using the PM Square methodology globally. So I know Ionut will say more from the perspective of the Alliance.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Just to pick up on what you just said, Despina, indeed, the support of an open source solution is mainly there by the users. And to give you a historical example, if you wish, Facebook was built with PHP, which is a programming language that's open source. And at a certain point in time, they realized that the solution, so the PHP programming language, was limited for their needs. So they improved upon it while maintaining it in the same format. So in this case, is the same thing. The users, and this is the beauty of open source in general, the users feel compelled to contribute because it's not just for them, it's for the community. And the feeling you get when you're contributing towards a community is really special. So this is why having something that's in an open source community is much more dynamic and much more resistant when it comes to supporting it. When it comes to PM Square Alliance, this is something that we mentioned a bit before. We want to ensure that contributions are there, and this is why we've set up this GitHub infrastructure and the GitHub project, which from our perspective is a strategic project in ensuring the evolution of the methodology. And we've set around it an entire workflow and teams that ensure that all of these contributions go in the right direction and that the methodology evolves into something that the community needs and wants. So excellent. Support is already there. We're actually in a process of expanding the community. So this, from my perspective, will only get better.
Excellent. And also the European Commission Center of Excellence on PM remains active, if I assume, Ionut as well?
Yes, indeed.
So therefore, the contributors will be regular, the core team, as we call, of contributors. And the question comes as to what kind of different derivatives, what kind of different platforms do we wish to work on? So the announcement about a few months ago of the open project, open source app in Ruby, with the enterprise, I do not recall the name of the enterprise, but I think it is based in Belgium, if I recall, or somewhere near. The more important thing is they have a vested interest in keeping PM Square alive if they start developing a version of their products that are relying on PM Square. So I guess the question of who is who creates dependency. We have a dependency, we need to work on it. As you may recall, something like 7 years ago, there was still a major trend. If you work, for example, in the organizations like Open Object Management Group, OMG, in IT, it's one of the many sort of a standardization group. And the level of activity is contingent on the dependency of products on those, of course. And now comes the issue, who will PM Square create dependency on? Who will rather be influenced in terms of dependency on PM Square? And my belief is actually the following. And I have to mention as well, in parallel, completely in parallel to what the Alliance is doing with GitLab, with GitHub, we have a team in Canada where, and hopefully soon enough, we'll be very open to more participants. We have a GitLab that publishes the PM Square, but in another format called Eclipse Process Framework, EPF, which allows, of course, anyone in the community to then further edit PM Square in a different way than is currently done on GitLab and GitHub. So these two perspectives will soon hopefully communicate with one another. But many more approaches need to be followed. And I believe the likelihood is those who have time and who have literally are paid to do that will eventually become core teams of different teams. And I would bet that academia is possibly going to become that place. The reason is because professors and their fellow researchers, PhD students very often, are paid through public, of course, funds to perform that kind of work. And it has not yet been the case, of course, because the first initiative that was funded, the Jean Monnet Chair in Spain with uh, who's professor. I'm so sorry. I hope he listens to us today. He will remind me of his name. Both of you would know. Ionut would know. The more important thing, though, we have an effort there to develop the first academically based materials to complement what the commission has done. But soon enough, it will be another round, several other rounds of funding that will attract researchers. And in Europe, by the way, compared to Canada, we're so envious of Europe. For academia, research is funded over there. Over here, I mean, frankly, it's literally 1/100th of what Europe offers in terms even proportionally to the GDP. So I'm trying to emphasize the fact that the people in academia will need to position their ideas. PM Square is a perfect platform for that because it makes it very flexible to do so. And secondly, these ideas, the tendency to contribute freely in academia is easy. It's kind of instinctive. It's part of our nature. So definitely, I think the movement for the next couple of years, and then afterwards, perhaps vendors will come into play. Within 3 years, I would say, vendors will become very dependent on PM Square, and then vendors will take over the whole room, literally. So therefore, the facets, all these changes that will happen to the PM Square, I would say ecosystem again, as Despina emphasized, I think we'll have different players at different phases. It's going to be, again, an interesting problem to look at, an interesting problem to study. The next one, question 5. Oh, that is a painful one, isn't it? Cost. Do we have a lower cost with PM Square? Despina.
Okay. I think so, yes. We should
Okay.
have. I think, we already mentioned that there are many open resources, and with with making sure that we use open licenses, so these are available with no cost. So as Ionut said before, even for smaller organizations that cannot invest at front, the methodology and the material and the resources are there. Also, I think, in terms, as you said, and as you described very well, the ecosystem, I like that you have a very detailed business plan of exactly what's going to happen in the next couple of years. We can discuss that again in a few years and see how close you were. But yes, I think, as the demand and the adaptation of PM Square grows and the users and their needs grows, then the community will grow, and that subsequently will go to the resources will grow. Not only resources in terms of papers or, learning material, but also in terms of tools. As you said, probably the vendors will come in at some point. So when you have a bigger pool of resources, not only in papers, but also in tools that will take into mind the user needs, You might not have like customized, ready-made to use tools, but because we are reaching out to the open source communities, you might have a good baseline to build your customized tools. So you don't have to start from scratch. There are some initial resources that you can build on. So obviously, this should be cheaper and from other methodologies that you have to use.
Good principle. Thank you. For Ionut.
Yes, I was reflecting on what do you mean by cost? Because cost has several facets. It can be people, it can be money, it can be time. So nothing is completely free, you know, like you snap your fingers and it happens. So obviously there is some investment. The question is how accessible is for everybody to make that investment. Because if we take dimensions one by one, if we're talking about money, as an open source methodology, all the material is free. So that's from the start a lower cost. So you don't have to pay for the material. The second immediate cost is time. How much time do you need to invest in learning this? As we mentioned at the beginning, being it a much slimmer and more agile methodology, it requires less upfront investment to get you going for the projects that you want to do. And then if you're talking about people, again, we partially answered a bit before, an open source community is always going to be bigger than a closed community, because considering the initial two, the methodology is much more disseminated in the community. So then as a result, you'll have more specialists, especially as time goes by, you'll have more specialists that know the methodology and will be able to assist further. So yeah, I think it's clearly cheaper than any other paid for methodology. It's not free, but it's definitely cheaper.
Thank you. And one aspect that you mentioned there, people, we don't mention the issue of professional maintenance, I would say, professional continuous learning and recertification. I mention it here because obviously it's an important aspect that constrains us as professionals, and secondly, constrains the PMO or chief PM hiring managers who are concerned with the cost of their professional services and the cost of consultants. If consultants have lower costs themselves, of course, automatically they can pass on and compete with lower costs, lower prices to the hiring managers. And I think in some ways that's where the costs will, to use a very old sentence, trickle down to the organizations. And in some ways it is not visible yet because the hiring managers have not made it a conditions yet that PM square be a requirement. I think professionals themselves, though, know truly that the cost to themselves of maintaining themselves with PM square is much more manageable, much more approachable. And another aspect, of course, that we mentioned is the issue of cost for whom. The cost for the public sector, while it has been so many years now that it's not been challenged, uh, public sectors everywhere have been continuing to invest heavily in proprietary software, proprietary methodologies, proprietary closed source support. And the challenging, as Despina is doing in her country, literally challenging the government to actually do otherwise, is starting to become unbearable. Most governments are going to have to abide to a portion of their asset expenditure to be open source. And that will come to consulting as well, technically. So overall, cost for whom is the issue as well, I think. But again, excellent answers. Thank you very much. And question 6, infrastructure for contributions. We could invite Despina first, please.
Okay, I feel that we are, it's not fair to Unit that I always go first, but yes, I think we already mentioned, and Unit already mentioned that there's a GitHub version, and you said that you have a GitLab version, and these public repositories are always a very good starting point for attracting community contributions. However, I think, as I said before, there should be a strategic decision about community building. And in order to have a successful community building, we should always take into account the user needs that will come from both the public sector and the private sector. And when we say public sector, not only central government, but even small municipalities and regional authorities, they have different needs at some points. But also there are different sectors, like in terms of thematics. So, the needs that construction or tourism has are obviously different. So this should all be taken into account in order to drift the community into the contributions that you're going to make. So I know the infrastructures are there, but always a push is always good to help getting the community building.
Excellent. Unit.
Yes. Um, I will not go into the technical sides of the matter, but indeed we have this GitHub project that basically offers the infrastructure and the means to enable such contributions. And we have already set in place a workflow that manages the contributions, and not just the contributions, but actually the any involvement. So not something that will necessarily get into the future version of the guide, so not in that sense of a contribution, but any interaction, any suggestion, any type of community involvement is taken into account. And besides that, we, with the Alliance, we have set up in place an entire ecosystem that basically supports this type of contributions. So we're talking about the regional coordinators network. We're talking about the volunteer network, the advisory committees that we have set in place. So all of these elements, and not only, we have the academic program, the student ambassadors program. So there are really a lot of sources of contribution that we have already included in this ecosystem. We have set up the means on how these contributions are properly managed, and we are just kickstarting the process. So the only concern that I have is that people will be so eager to contribute that we will be overwhelmed with the amount of contributions that we'll have to manage. That's my only concern.
That's a beautiful problem.
Yeah, that's a good problem to have.
Yeah, but other than that, I'm really very confident that we'll have contributions, and we have the process set up. So we're ready to have this pushing forward.
And thank you, because Unit, you remind me now, of course, that there's more than just assets to be developed. So of course, there's so many infrastructural aspects. And it brings me back to the discussion yesterday at the end of the day for the panel on education. The three faculty who were discussing that mentioned very heavily the fact that, well, if there is no, technically, if there is no funding for such infrastructure, organizational infrastructure, the development, of course, in academia won't go on. I mean, technically, it has to be funded somehow. So technically, indeed, the question of if the ecosystem that PM Square Alliance is building so far develops, is, for example, we mentioned earlier the trained trainer program that the Alliance has started. If that goes on, if there is more and more professionals wanting to play that role, technically, yes, the fabric of that infrastructure will remain. I think also is the issue not of price but quality in the same time. What I have seen in some communities that are closed copyrights is a big change in quality of the services we receive. And that has caused, I think, in some cases, disarray. Some organizations are in disarray. They have no control over quality. And I think PM Square at this moment, I've noticed in the website at least, because I'm not involved in your groups directly, but from the sense that the effort to maintain quality is there, and the effort of maintaining quality also in contributions, not just services, not just assets, but services and community membership as well. So technically, I think price, but also quality will determine to what extent contributions are welcome or will remain peripheral, technically. So thank you very much. And then at the end, last questions, and we have about 5 minutes left after this one. Very, very brief answers so we can address one or two questions from the audience, please. Judith, if you don't mind, you are the fork specialist.
Okay, so when we're talking about forking, this is a bit of a technical term. It's basically when you create derivative work. So if you take the original work and you create something based on that. The platform that we chose, GitHub, and the platform that you have for your project, GitLab, offer built-in support for such an activity. And this is a great way to see the way the versions evolve. We are definitely encouraged to have the community contribute, and if they feel like special tailoring or changes need to be done for their specific domain, the licensing model that we've put in place ensures and supports this type of activity. And also because we've chosen the Creative Commons license to have for the material, this also enforces that the derivative work will be available for further forking, let's say. So that's a great way to have the community contribute in the areas that they feel that this is required. They can always contribute directly to the methodology, but again, if they feel that they have a specific case where they need special tailoring and special customization, then this ability is there, and everybody's welcome to do that if they feel the need to do so.
Excellent. And Despina?
Yeah, I just have a brief comment because, as you said, Ionut is the expert in forking. It's more of a recommendation, I would say, to the alliance, since they already have in place the GitHub, and you have in place the GitLab version, and everything can be forked there. It's a good way to have a policy on how you will later integrate or merge useful extensions or derivative work that from forks to the core methodology. So it's important to see, other people are obviously taking part and contributing, and something that may come up from this work might be useful to merge into the core and initial work that you have already put on GitHub or GitLab. So, just a policy on how you will do that will give a better sense to the community on how they can contribute. And as you said, Stephane, it will allow the quality standards to stay as they are.
Thank you very much. Indeed, that's the question of vetting every contribution and re-merging certain branches. And comes the set of questions from the audience, if you don't mind. One question, I take them in different order. One question mentioned the fact that GitLab and GitHub, of course, are not properly promoted yet. I guess, Ionut, you will announce your GitHub very soon within the community.
Yeah, indeed. So up until now, and I saw that there is a different question that mentions that there is little visible activity, and that is true mainly because we didn't launch the project. So the official launch has been done in this conference. So we have a different session that explains just that. So obviously, contributions and forks until now were not really possible.
Okay.
But we have a lot of things already in the pipeline, and we have a release schedule to have them in the GitHub repository. So we're just at the first step now. So with this project being public, we've announced it, and now we encourage everybody to start contributing. And there will be a separate track announcing this. We've just started announcing it, so obviously contributions will start on this.
Excellent. The same thing with our GitLab. We need to make an official launch and include one specifically for PM Square, because PM Square is a big asset in our project. And second question was about an open source app that provides a readily implemented PM Square template or environment. I think, Despina, you might know Open Project, of course,
Well,
is.
yeah, as I said, I think Ionut again might have more details about that, but I know that at least a few years back we have had a discussion with that about that with Nicholas, and we recommended to find a proper tool or a platform or something that it's already there that could be either adjusted, or they can collaborate and work together to see how they can fit the software with the PM Square methodology. And I know, and this is why I said Ionut might want to say more on that there is a collaboration. I don't know if something is announced yet, or it will be with the open project now. And so I don't think there's something in place yet that fits exactly the methodology, but it should be. And it's a good opportunity to see how we can make the methodology and the software, the project management software that exists, work together.
Excellent. Unit, 30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds. So indeed, we are now collaborating with the people from Open Project, and we have a separate track on that in order to include the PM Square in their products. And the GitHub project actually serves as a means for that, because they will feed the information regarding PM Square from the GitHub project into the products they have, so that way they are always up to date and in sync.
So I wanted to say thank you very much to Despina and to Ionut for your excellent viewpoints. It's strange we haven't torn one another today on the public place. And we invite you, of course, to continue on the Q&A, which the three of us will take time to answer today, as we, of course, make sure that everything is covered. Again, thank you very much to everyone, and of course, to continue seeing you tomorrow as well at the third day of the conference. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.